All right, thank you for being here. Today we're going to be talking about business ethics and social responsibility. Very important topic in the world of business, as we've seen from just the last several years. Just the prevalence of unethical behavior, particularly among top management, with issues and situations such as those at Enron and Tyco and WorldCom and countless others, really, that have just made it so much more obvious just the importance of ethical behavior, especially at the top, because as we find, the behavior of top management begins to filter down to the employees at kind of the rank and file positions. And if you're in an organization that ethical behavior is something that is maybe allowed, maybe even encouraged for the sake of getting profits and short-term gains, then obviously that's going to be kind of perpetuated throughout the entire culture of that particular company. So an extremely important part. So over the course of this brief lecture here, we're going to go over really what business ethics is, social responsibility, define that, and then go over some of the more prominent issues facing businesses as they continue to operate in a client such as the one that we're in now. So to start us off, really, what is ethics? Ethics, very simply, are beliefs about what is right and wrong, essentially what is good and bad. And obviously something that's considered to be ethical behavior is something that conforms to our personal beliefs about what is right and what is good. And the interesting thing about ethics is it's something that is kind of in the eye of the beholder, if you will, meaning that you can have a room full of people and based upon give them a certain situation, and everyone is going to take away something different, and everyone may have a different leaning with regards to if it is something that is ethical. Now, conversely, unethical behavior is obviously behavior that does not conform to an individual's belief about what is right or good. So essentially it is something they do not find to be ethical in that sense. And what's interesting is that these are based a lot in part on individual morals and values, and also their social context in which you grew up in. So for example, if you grew up in a home where it was considered to be okay to maybe fudge a little bit on your tax return, maybe claim something as a deduction when in reality it maybe wasn't, something very minuscule, something small, likelihood is that when you grew up and then get to the point to where you're filing your own individual tax returns, that you may view that as acceptable behavior. So it depends a lot upon conditioning, the environment in which you grew up in. Also, obviously, but your individual values and different things, and a lot of that, like I said before, was based upon how you grew up and how you were raised, among other things, of course. Now, interestingly enough, there's been a few studies that have been done with regards to why people cheat, lie, steal, all those different types of things. And there was a study done by Dan Ariely, in which he actually published a book which is called The Honest Truth About Dishonesty. And he did a number of different studies with regards to why people essentially lie. And he, essentially, his hypothesis was that people generally lie just a little bit. Not in significant amounts, obviously, those are rare. But everyone generally lies in a small amount. So what you see on your screen here, probably wondering what this is. This is a matrix. And this is what they used in their actual experiments. So what they did was they passed out a number of these to college students in a large lecture hall. And what they did was they said, you know what, we're going to go ahead and pay you for each one you can solve. And as you can see, there are a number of different selection of different numbers here. And the idea is that you find the two numbers that can add up to 10. And so students were paid based upon how many they can solve. Okay. So first, they just did the regular experiment. So students could essentially solve, they had, I believe it was about 5 minutes to solve as many as they could. And the average during that study was about 4. And the average person would solve about 4 matrices, essentially getting them, a certain amount of money. I believe they paid them around 10 to 50 cents per matrices. And so what they did after that, they said, you know what, let's add a condition to it. Let's put a shredder in the back of the room and tell the students, you know what, once you're done, go ahead and take your matrices, walk to the back of the room, shred them, and then walk to the front and tell us how many you solved. And so you're obviously instilling some trust in the person that they're going to be honest with you and give you an accurate reading, essentially, of what you performed, what your accurate performance. So what they found is the average then increased to 6. Okay, so interestingly enough, everyone kind of got smarter. And so the average was 6. Like I said, they solved 6 matrices. So you may look at this and think, that's not really significant, right? To go from 4 to 6, you know, it's not like anybody solved, let's say, 20. Okay, that would be completely ridiculous, which I believe that was the max that you could actually solve. That's the max that people were given, was 20 matrices. And so they solved 6. And so this supports that people with the opportunity cheat just a little bit. Not in significant amounts generally, but just a little bit, of course. Okay, so they started to play a little bit more with the conditions. Okay, they thought, well, obviously if we institute the ability for them to be a little bit deceitful in terms of covering up how much they actually performed, let's institute a number of different things. Let's actually pay them $10 per matrices instead of just the 50 cents we were paying them before. Okay, and so they did the same exact thing, $10 instead of 50 cents, and what they found is that people actually cheated less. And so what the theory is that people, when they're faced with these large rewards, it gets really difficult to look yourself in the mirror and think you're an honest person when you're cheating a significant amount. You know, getting a significant reward, it's much more difficult to go through with it, at least for the general population. Obviously, there are people that you're probably thinking of that would think they probably wouldn't have a problem doing that. And that's a case-by-case basis. But generally speaking, we have a problem with cheating to the point to where it significantly benefits our individual positions, which is what was found in the study. Next, a very interesting thing, they put an actor in the scenario, in the experiment. And what that person's job was to do was to get up after about a minute and claim they solved all 20 matrices. Okay, and then obviously walk to the front, everybody's watching them, hand in their 20 matrices, and then collect their full payment and then walk out the door. And what they found was that happening significantly increased the likelihood of people cheating, because they found that it was okay. Obviously, if this person did that same thing, got away with it, they're obviously cheating, solving 20 matrices in 1 minute or less. It's very obvious. So it must be okay to do that. And so that increases the likelihood of us cheating. In a separate study that I don't want to go into too much detail because these are very complex studies, so I'm just going over some of the findings. But another study, interestingly enough, was done, I believe, at the University of Michigan. And they performed a similar type test. I'm not sure on the specific exactly, but they put an actor in the room who was wearing an Ohio State jersey. And if you're familiar, maybe it was in a jersey, maybe it was an Ohio State shirt, something that distinguished them as coming from Ohio State. Now, if you're familiar with the two universities, you'll know that there's a rivalry between the two. So they really don't like each other. So this person that was dressed in Ohio State apparel solved their particular matrices, got up, walked, collected their money. And what they found was everyone else in the room didn't cheat. In fact, they took the whole time. They were very honest with what their performance was. And so you look at that and you think, we cheat for a number of different reasons. One of which, the dishonesty might stem from the fact that there's somebody doing it that we like, that we want to maybe associate with. But then you look at it from the standpoint of maybe it's someone that's cheating that we don't like and we don't want to associate with. And that's what you saw in the Ohio State and Michigan study, is that people didn't want to associate with someone of a competing school and felt that, well, they're cheating, that's them, they have lower standards, we're going to hold ourselves maybe to a higher standard. Interestingly enough, they did the same exact study, but had someone with dressed in Michigan apparel stand up, walk out the room, and then everyone was more likely to cheat. So that just kind of supports that particular statement there. But it is interesting to consider the fact that everyone maybe lies and cheats just a little bit, but not to the extent that they feel that they are maybe harming their own personal code of ethics, and maybe it's difficult to look themselves in the mirror at the end of the day. You know, people are notorious for maybe taking office supplies, you know, pens, pencils, a notepad here and there. nothing very significant. Obviously, they're not walking away with hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. Of course, we've seen that some people do end up doing that, but it's not as common. And so maybe there is a support for the position that people are okay with maybe lying and cheating just a little bit, not because they're afraid of getting caught, because they're afraid of having to look themselves in the mirror at the end of the day. All right, so let's look at ethics and really how to evaluate ethical decisions, of course. The first thing that you consider when looking at something from an ethical framework is, are we breaking any laws? That is the basic litmus test for if something is considered to be ethical. Okay? Generally, laws provide some type of consensus regarding ethical behavior, meaning that if there's a law about something, generally people agree that it's not ethical, right? Generally, people would think that stealing usually is not, well, it's always not legal. So obviously there's a consensus that stealing isn't considered to be ethical, of course. That's a general consensus, okay? But one of the things to consider is that the law is merely the starting point for the ethical discussion. Simply by checking, the legal code and finding out, this is completely okay. We can pay child labor or child laborers in third world countries. We're not breaking any laws. So we're good on the ethical part. Well, maybe not, right? Here in the U.S., we would regard that as probably unethical behavior, at least the consensus would be. So looking from the legality standpoint is merely just one thing to do in terms of assessing it on its ethical merits. Now, stealing is an interesting concept, and I introduced this a few moments ago because people's perceptions, or at least opinions of stealing, change depending upon the situation. Usually one of the things I do in class is we have a discussion about stealing, and we talk about, well, let's see, show of hands. Does everyone agree that stealing is unethical? To take something that you didn't rightfully obtain through some type of monetary payment, obviously, or verbal agreement, whatever it is, obviously obtaining it ethically, we would consider that to not be okay. And everyone says, yeah, you know what? I wouldn't consider that to be okay. I wouldn't want people taking my things, so yeah, that's not ethical. And then we introduce a number of different situations. And one of them that I always like to introduce is the Hurricane Katrina test. And in 2005, obviously Hurricane Katrina went through the Gulf and caused a significant amount of devastation in that area of the U.S. And one of the things that happened is that area was kind of cut off from supplies and different things for a number of days, obviously making it difficult for the people that were still in that particular area of Katrina. I believe it was the 9th Ward, if I'm not mistaken. And so one of the things that people resorted to was stealing. Now, not necessarily looting flat screen TVs, although there were, obviously, you probably saw some pictures and images of people doing that. What you would need a flat screen TV for when your house is completely engulfed in water, I have no idea, but you know what? Maybe that works for some people. But people were actually stealing and looting canned goods, water, those types of things that people needed to survive. And so in that particular situation, if you are in Hurricane Katrina, or in the aftermath, if you will, in that area, and you have a decision to make, well, I have a wife and kids, or, spouse and kids, whoever that may be, and you know what, I don't necessarily think stealing is ethical, but in this situation, I don't have any alternatives. Would you consider it to be ethical there? Maybe not, but maybe you'd think, well, it still had to be done. Right? Maybe it's not ideal, but in that situation, I may be inclined to. And so not only considering the legality, but also considering the situation for what it is. It's very difficult to have a cookie cutter response to every situation, because as you begin to introduce new variables, people's perceptions of what is considered to be ethical versus unethical changes. And we're going to go over really, how do you evaluate that? What are some things that you can do to consider that? Okay. So let's look at ethics here. Now, obviously, ethics is a reflection of your individual values, okay, your values that you were brought up with, morals, your culture, okay. those have a significant impact on ethical decision making. Very, very extremely important. I cannot emphasize that enough, is that you can line up 10 different people in a room and ask them situations regarding ethics, very specific, not general like is stealing okay, but very specific situations, and generally you'll get 10 different responses. Because we evaluate these things not only based upon our own values, morals, and culture, but also our own experiences. Things that we've lived through shape our view of what is considered to be ethical. Now, this creates kind of a problem for organizations, because if you're hiring, and obviously organizations and businesses want to have a very diverse workforce, because you get people who have different backgrounds, different perspectives on things. You never want to have an organization in which everyone thinks the same. That's how a concept known as groupthink happens, which is very detrimental if everyone always agrees, because generally that means you're overlooking something. So we know that there's a benefit of diversity. Okay, we know that that's present, but how do we take into consideration the fact that everyone is going to consider a certain situation different from an ethical standpoint? Well, organizations can do a number of different things to try and maintain at least some type of consistency among their employees. Okay. The first of which, and you've probably seen these, is that organizations start what are called written code of ethics, or codes of conduct, maybe the terminology used. They're essentially the same thing. And this is a tangible, physical, actual document that's usually posted in a public place. It's available usually on a company intranet, and is widely circulated among employees. Usually if you get hired onto an organization, you usually have to review the code of ethics and sign a form that says you're going to agree to behave in an ethical manner, and obviously in conjunction with that particular code of ethics. So what these do is they outline what is acceptable behavior. Okay, and the purpose of that is to at least establish some type of baseline, right? Establish a foundation in which everybody is aware of what's okay and what's not okay. Typically, you'll see things like the golden rule. Obviously, treat people the way that you would want to be treated, and those types of things would appear in corporate code of ethics or codes of conduct. Okay, now obviously, a code of ethics and code of conduct can't include every single situation. Obviously, that would be impossible. The thing would be entirely too long and would take years to develop to encompass every single situation, because every situation is different. Okay, but they can cover at least some of the more general themes, if you will, just to make sure that everyone has an understanding. Okay. A lot of companies also institute what are known as ethics programs. Some companies have training programs called Ethics U for Ethics University, and that represents a training program that's designed to present employees with certain situations, and then they have to judge them based on their ethical merits. I remember going through a few training programs in which it was situation-based, and so they would show videos of certain obviously situations and happening, certain exchanges between employees, and there would be a discussion on, okay, do you believe this was ethical? Why or why not? What did you pick up on? All these different things. And so it's more of a case study, if you will, of actual ethical behavior, which can be very, very, very good. Obviously, it's expensive, it takes time, but it can be very, very effective. Okay. Some companies do maybe some role playing, and when you have people that act out certain situations, and then once again you have a panel of maybe new hire employees or employees that are going through the program again if you have to re-up your training every year, and are having a discussion based upon that. Now, speaking for myself, I do know that some of the situations are blatantly obvious. So it's one of those things where you would have to be a very, very unethical person not to, okay, yeah, that is unethical. Yeah, you can't just steal things, or it's not really good to physically assault coworkers. Yeah, that's probably not a good thing. But there is some usefulness, there is some effectiveness to them, although sometimes the scenarios can be a little comical, if you will. Next, a lot of companies establish ethics hotlines, and these are completely anonymous phone numbers that you can call to report potential unethical behavior. And this is really meant to minimize the maybe the obstacles that people encompass, although they're more mental obstacles than physical, when reporting unethical behavior. And companies do not want these things to go hidden for a long period of time, because that's when they can kind of balloon and get out of control, and then all of a sudden they're in the media, and then the company has a big PR battle on their hands. Instead, they want to be aware of these things because they generally want to fix them, usually. Although there are certain situations in which corporate officers did not want to fix unethical behavior and were the pioneers of that. But generally speaking, unethical behavior isn't good for business. Okay, generally that results in lost sales. Customers don't want to do business with you. Suppliers don't want to do business with you. And there's a lot of issues there, of course. So making it anonymous allows people free of the stigma of having to report that, the feeling of maybe some type of retribution, feeling that I'm going to be retaliated against. And also, a lot of times, what if the person that's committing the ethical behavior is a peer or even a boss, right? A supervisor. Then it becomes really difficult, because then you're reporting to that person, hey, I want to report unethical behavior against you. Very, very awkward conversation to have. And so maybe it's easier to report it anonymously, call a phone number, and have it work through the back channels. The next component of establishing an ethical culture from an organization standpoint is leadership by example. And I mentioned this before at the beginning of lecture here, and this is a very, very important piece, is establishing an environment that views unethical behavior as not okay. And simply top leadership beginning to preach it's important to be ethical and all these different things isn't enough. There has to be the behavior behind it, right? It's not only important people say, but what they actually do. And generally what they do is what commands the most attention, right? So that is an important piece there. One of the big players, of course, at the beginning of the millennium of 2000 was Enron. And Enron, of course, was in charge of a big energy company. They distributed, were kind of a wholesaler, if you will, and getting energy to some of the different companies to sell to consumers like us. And they had a lot of issues in the terms of overinflating earnings. They would credit expenses as revenues, which obviously is not ideal if you have to pay it, but instead you report it as something that you received. And so certainly deceived investors for a long period of time, just for the purpose of increasing the stock price short term to generate income and generate share price appreciation for corporate officers. So let's watch a quick video here real quick on Enron so you get a better idea of what they did. Of course, Ken Lay, who was the CEO of Enron at that particular point in time, obviously said, well, at Enron we always deal with people in an ethical manner and all these different things. And it just illustrates the importance of leadership by example. It isn't important enough to simply say the things that you want done, but you have to in turn follow through with them in terms of your behavior. That is what's going to speak more loudly to your employees, of course. All right, now, is it ethical? We're going to go through just some scenarios here real quick, or some things that you can do to kind of evaluate whether or not something is ethical, or should be ethical, or is considered to be ethical, of course. We talked about the first one being legality, right? Are we breaking any laws? Okay, obviously, if you're breaking a law, chances are it's going to be considered to be an unethical decision or unethical issue. Now, there are certain situations that obviously the law, it may still be considered to be ethical, but they're very rare and few and far in between. Next thing you consider is utility, right? Are you optimizing the personal benefits of someone at the expense of others? Right? Are you increasing maybe your financial gain out of a particular situation at the expense of other people? Okay, that's one thing to consider, of course. Justice. Are we respecting the rights of everyone involved? Does everyone have the right to equal opportunity in the workplace? Okay, are we unfairly benefiting somebody at the expense of others? And one interesting thing is you'll find that a lot of these kind of tie into one another, right? Respecting the rights of everyone is very similar if something increases somebody's benefit at the detriment of someone else. So they do have some correlation there. Next thing to consider is caring, right? Is it consistent with people's responsibilities to one another? Okay. Obviously, we have a responsibility to look out for other people, or at least we should. The responsibility to look out for customers, to act in their best interest. The responsibility to look out for the interests of our shareholders. And so is it consistent with that? Are we being good stewards of the responsibility that we've been given? And then one of them that I always like here, and this is kind of my personal evaluation technique, if you will, is the Times Squares test, or Times Square test. And that is, if what you're doing in the kind of deepest, darkest, most remote places in the world will be broadcast in Times Square, on the big jumbotrons they have there in Times Square, is that something that you would be okay with? Okay. Chances are, if it isn't, it probably is leaning towards more of a something that's unethical on the spectrum. And so you may have to dive in a little further and evaluate it further. So that is something that you can consider when you're being approached by a particular situation and you're having to evaluate it based on its ethical merits. All right, let's look at social responsibility now. That we've kind of laid the foundation, if you will, talking about ethics, what they are, and those different things. Let's talk a little about social responsibility. And social responsibility, a very important topic here, really just refers to the overall ways that businesses attempt to kind of balance their commitments to different groups, mainly to their stakeholders. And stakeholders are all those individuals that have maybe an interest in the particular company's behavior or the company's actions, if you will. And these include a number of different people. And the issue with social responsibility is you'll find that all of the groups sometimes have competing interests. Right? For example, you have employees and you have shareholders. Employees, you generally want to pay a competitive wage, maybe a little higher than market value, but at the same time, you have your shareholders, which would actually like that money to go towards other things possibly. So there are some competing interests that have to be considered for businesses. But let's take a quick look at kind of the stakeholder approach, if you will. And this is just a simple approach to evaluating particular decisions and those that have a potential to be involved or be harmed or benefited based upon the actual decision. So the first group we have are obviously employees. Employees, very, very important, pivotal piece to the performance of an organization. Without employees, nothing happens. And so a company has to conduct or operate in a way that is responsible to its employees. This includes things like fair recruiting, hiring, promoting, and compensation practices, doing so that's based upon what people can do rather than who they are, their physical makeup, ethnicity, race, gender, all those different things. Are you promoting people or hiring them based upon how they perform or based upon who they know or based upon what group they associate with? Okay, it's not fair for businesses to discriminate against employees unless it's based upon something that's considered to be what's called a bona fide occupational qualification. That's something that is required to perform the job, if you will. Okay. So, besides obviously hiring, promotion, compensation practices, employees obviously should be entitled to a workplace that's free from any physical harm, obviously a safe work environment, some benefits, all those different types of things. You can fill in the blanks. But organizations obviously have a responsibility to employees to make sure and look after them. In exchange, obviously, employees are willing to provide certain effort, time, all those different things in exchange for what they receive in terms of salary, benefits, recognition, prestige, all those other things. All right, next we have customers. Obviously, if a business or an organization does not take care of its customers, it's probably not going to be around very long, especially in the environment that we live in, where you have numerous different social media websites. It's very easy for us to express our disinterest to a wide audience rather quickly. It really doesn't take any effort. So businesses need to be very, very cautious in how they treat customers. They need to obviously price their products that are in a fair manner and not necessarily gouge customers in terms of pricing. They need to offer products and services that are safe, if you will, products that are safe and not going to harm customers. Okay. We'll talk about some of the different unfair pricing strategies in a second here once we get through this particular slide. Investors. Obviously, organizations need to look after the interests of investors as well. If investor confidence is shaken, which it has been, or it was after the kind of Enron and Tyco and WorldCom scandals that took place in early 2000s, if investor confidence is shaken, they're not going to put their money into different companies. And that's very bad because what we're going to talk about later in this semester from an accounting standpoint is that one of the major ways that companies get money is from investors. And if investors are unsure if the company is going to act in an ethical manner, chances are they're not going to invest their hard-earned money. So investors need to have some type of confidence in management. Managers have a duty to act in the best interests of their shareholders, people that hold particular stock in their company, of course. And if management abuses their financial resources and acts responsibly, then it's going to affect how confident investors are and how willing they are to put their money into a particular company. Some common topics that come up here include paying excessive salaries for managers. You can do a quick search online and find out just some of the salaries that some of these CEOs and different kind of executive level positions pay. And so, although it's not considered to be illegal, it might be unethical when your CEO is making 500 times more than the average worker in the company. Do they provide that much value? Some people might say, well, yes, they do. They shape the direction of the company, of course. Or some might say, well, no, they don't. They're more valuable, but not 500 times more. That's pretty ridiculous. All right, and also the community. It's important that companies act as good stewards, or at least financially or socially responsible in the communities they operate in. There are a lot of companies that will provide time off for their employees to get out into the community and to do things such as, clean up parks or to build homes and all these different things. And this is very important because a company needs to be very responsible to the community, and that really looks positively upon them. You see a lot of things out there with companies that are doing extra efforts to, increase or enhance the communities around them, and that's a very, very important part there because obviously not only from a standpoint of we're providing jobs in the area, but we also want to make life better for people in the community. And lastly, the environment. The environment has been something that's been increasingly talked about and very, very important, even more so now in the time that we live in. There's been an increased kind of attention towards the global climate change, and that's really resulted on pressures on businesses to reduce their negative impact that they have on the environment. Many companies are marketing their efforts to go green. And that's really an attempt to cater towards kind of the environmentally conscious consumers. And so it's important that, companies no longer use maybe styrofoam products because those obviously they stay around for a very long time and are kind of packing up landfills and different things, and they're not biodegradable, which is the word I was looking for. So that's a very, very important part is for businesses to consider what their impact is on the environment, because that can also deter sales as well. If, like I said before, especially how easy it is to find these things out now in the the digital and technological age that we live in. If a company is not acting in an environmentally responsible manner, that can harm their ability to sell their particular products or services to consumers. Because generally, consumers as us, we want to associate with a company that is being responsible and respectful to the environment. All right, so let's evaluate these things a little more closely, if you will, and talk about social responsibility in some of these different groups. Some of these I might go through a little faster because I did kind of go over them in a little in greater detail beforehand, and I don't want to be overly redundant, of course. A little redundant's not too bad, but overly redundant obviously isn't ideal. So let's talk about social responsibility and employees. Very, very important. We talked about fairness in recruiting and hiring, promoting and compensation practices, following minimum wage laws, right? OSHA, the Occupation and Safety Health Administration, very important to follow them. Workers' compensation practices, providing environments that are free of harassment of any kind, whether it be sexual or any other kind. And also an interesting thing is that companies now are leaning towards providing a work-life balance. And what I mean by that is, gone are the days when it was considered to be okay to go to the office and to work, and work 16 hours a day and then to come home. Now what we're finding, because there's been a shift socially in the dynamics of the home, is that people like the work-life balance, right? There are more women now in the workplace, and because if they have young children at home, obviously they don't want to be at work all day, every day, 7 days a week. And so there's more of a shift now towards companies providing work-life balance, personal time off, flexible schedules, right? Working from home certain days. Those are things that from an employer standpoint are very attractive, right? If you're an employee and you're considering to work for a company and one has a great work-life balance program and one doesn't, you're probably going to go with the one that does offer that work-life balance, because that frees you up to spend time with family, which is very, very important. And one of the things that shifted in our current generation is there's more of an emphasis on being involved with family than there was before. Before it was, well, I'm going to go out and stake my claim and I'm going to do what I have to do, put in the hours and climb the corporate ladder. And now for the next generation, that doesn't necessarily sound as attractive as it once did. It certainly doesn't sound that attractive to me. So because of that shift, employers are realizing that they do have to institute new programs as a way of attracting highly qualified and talented workers. And next, there's a responsibility to customers. The importance of value of honesty and communication, of course, is very, very important. One of the things that we've seen a shift in is towards this concept which is known as consumerism. And consumerism really is a social movement that suggests that consumer rights should be the starting point. And President Kennedy defined these rights to be the following: the right to be safe, right to be informed, right to choose, and the right to be heard. But you're seeing, more importantly, a number of different groups come up that are designed to protect consumers. Everything from obviously the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, to even private groups that are looking after consumers. And so there's this increased shift of thinking that, well, organizations and businesses are out there to really just turn a profit, and they're going to do so by any means necessary, even if that's not true, but that might be the perception. And so there needs to be established some type of governing bodies as a way of looking out for the best interests of consumers and making sure that they have safe products, making sure that if they have concerns, they can voice those, and all these other things. Now, in our business climate, obviously you want to look after your consumers because that is who is paying you, and if they're not around, you're not going to be around very long. So it's extremely important to act responsibly towards consumers by doing things like honoring warranties and offering, reasonable exchange guidelines or exchange procedures, if you will, and all these other things, because that is what's going to continue to get customers to cater to your business. One important thing I want to bring up is this idea of price gouging and collusion. And for those of you that don't know, price gouging is essentially charging an exorbitant price when there's an increase in demand. So I'll give you an example. Let's say if there's a particular natural disaster and then water is considered to be scarce in a certain region, you operate a convenience store and then you jack up the price of water to like $10 when it's, maybe a couple bucks. Now that could be an example of price gouging, because what you're doing is you're responding to an increased demand but with a significant price increase because, well, what are you going to do, right? You need water. There's no one else around that has it, so obviously that's the case. Now, that's considered to be an unfair pricing practice and generally is illegal. Also, you have collusion, okay? And collusion is when you have two or more companies that collaborate with one another in an attempt to set a price. And collusion's bad because if we've talked about in economics and obviously having fair pricing and kind of the system in which we operate, it eliminates competition. Because now as a company, why am I going to be more innovative or try to cut costs more and do all these different things or make my products better than everyone else's if now we're priced the same? So it's fine. I have no more there's no more incentive for me to compete, which is very problematic. And so collusion is illegal and is not considered to be something that is acceptable. I have here, obviously, for those of you familiar with the app logo for iBooks, which if you have any type of Apple product, an iPhone, iPad, iPod Touch, you're familiar with this particular icon here. And the reason I put this here on the slide is to bring up the issue that Apple had back in 2011 when they were actually charged with collusion with regards to what they were charging for digital books. Just real briefly, I don't want to go into too much detail, but let me give you some backstory. The traditional model for pricing physical books and even digital books before that point in time is you have the publishers, right, people that actually publish and create the books, would agree to sell it to, let's say, a wholesaler or a retailer like a Target, Costco, those types. And they would have on the back of the books, you see where there's like a suggested retail price. They generally charge half of that to the actual wholesaler or the retailer. And then the retailer, after they've purchased it, they have the ability to do whatever they want. If they want to charge the full retail price, they can. Like take Costco, for example, if they want to discount it to where they're barely making any profit, they can. Like same thing with Amazon. If they want to discount it significantly to where they're making a couple bucks, they certainly can. That's their right. They purchased it clear and free, and so they can do what they want. So publishers weren't liking this from the digital standpoint because you would get Amazon, most notoriously, that would acquire these kind of digital rights to publish certain books or to sell them, and then they would sell them at $9.99. And so publishers didn't like this, but they couldn't really do anything about it because Amazon obviously is a very, very big company, and so they kind of went along with it. Part of the concern was from a publisher standpoint, just so you know, is that if digital books now are $9.99, who's going to buy a physical book, right, when it's twice as much, maybe sometimes more, okay? So Apple, in 2010, when they were coming out with the iPad, Steve Jobs got together with the book publishers and said, you know what, we want to change the way that this model works, and it's going to help you. We want to go to what we call an agency model. And what that means is you, the publisher, you set the price. Charge whatever you want. We'll take a cut, usually 30%. And so obviously if you charge more, it actually benefits us. So in the long run, the consumer will pay a little bit more money, but everyone else is happy. The publisher makes more, Apple, we make more money, and so this is good. But, and that's not the bad thing, right? That's not collusion at this point, but here's where collusion takes place. What you have to do, publishers, is you can't give anyone a better deal than we're getting. So if we have this deal, everyone else does, including Amazon. And so at that point in time, the exact date escapes me, but it was in 2010 where publishers contacted Amazon and said, hey, you know what? We have this deal with Apple. It's a binding contract. We can't charge any less, so we have to go to this agency shop or agency model with you as well. Okay. Obviously, a lot of companies or a lot of like Amazon and some others filed suit with the U.S. Department of Justice saying this was collusion, and they presented a particular case, and a lot of publishers agreed to settle, and some of the specifics are still being outlined. But a lot of the big publishers decided to just go ahead and settle and not do that. But, you know, long story short, an example of a collusion, because you're preventing Amazon from charging whatever they want. If they want to take a loss on a particular book, that's kind of up to them, right? It's their prerogative, if you will. And so it isn't fair for companies like Apple to try and, you know, change the model or the way that it's done for the purpose of increasing prices for consumers. And that's where the collusion took place, is prices generally went up. If you look at digital books, you begin to see that there wasn't anything really cheaper for a new book than $12.99. That was kind of the lowest price. And that was a direct result of these agency agreements that Apple reached with a lot of the publishers, and Amazon had to follow suit. All right. Next, a responsibility to investors. The very, very important thing from investors, we talked about confidence. If investors aren't confident about something, they're not going to put their money towards an investment. And that is what full disclosure is. And it's important that businesses, they're required by the SEC, which is the Securities and Exchange Commission, to publish quarterly statements going over, you know, profits, expenses, and all these other different financial statements that we'll get into later on in the semester. But it's very, very important. And so as a result of kind of the accounting scandals that took place with Enron and WorldCom and Tyco, Sarbanes-Oxley, commonly referred to as SOX, S-O-X, was passed that holds company executives to a higher standard and can have them criminally charged for obviously signing off on statements that aren't accurate. Most notably the CFO, who the CFO at Enron, who was, I believe, Andy Fastow, was one of the pioneers, if you will, of a lot of the unethical behavior that took place over at Enron and creating different companies to send expenses and revenues to different things, and a lot of creative accounting as it's referred to. And so Sarbanes-Oxley held the CFO position personally responsible for signing off on the accuracy of financial statements. Also did a lot of different things. Critics claim that it has a lot of red tape, a lot of regulation that creates a cost for businesses that makes them unable to compete, all those different things, but obviously there was some good that came out of it. Next is this concept of a fiduciary duty of management. And the fiduciary duty essentially is that managers have a responsibility to act in a way that's in the best interest of shareholders. To act in their best interest. And that sometimes becomes difficult because obviously people in the corporate level positions like your CEO, your CFO, they're people too. And so obviously it's only human nature to try and enhance your own gains at the expense of others. But management does have a fiduciary duty to act at the responsibility or as responsible to their particular investors. I have here an image of Groupon just to kind of talk about some of the creative accounting type things. And Groupon, although I'm not necessarily stating intentionally engaged in some unethical accounting, they did in a way, although it may not have been intentional. You can decide for yourself. But Groupon, if you know, back in, I believe it was 2010 or 2011 possibly, was going through a IPO, initial public offering. If you're not familiar with what that is, I believe your book talks about it. We're going to talk about it later in future weeks as well, so hold on for more on that. But Groupon, long story short, was basically double counting its revenues. Because the way Groupon's model works is they get a daily deal, right? They reach an agreement with a certain business, and then they take revenue from the consumer. And they were reporting that revenue on their actual statements. But what they weren't doing is weren't taking into consideration that they actually have to pay the business a little bit as well, because that's part of their agreement, right? We'll take this, we sell this particular daily deal, and then we're going to pay you maybe half or a certain negotiated percentage of that. But they weren't considering or factoring in the expenses to the businesses on their statements or on their financial statements. So in a way, they were overinflating their revenues, of course, and that really had a big impact on their IPO, and they actually delayed their initial public offering just because of that. Because when they put forth their statements to the SEC looked and said, "Hey, wait a minute, this isn't accurate. This is going to deceive investors who are going to take these as accurate and going to invest in your company and thinking there are twice as many revenues, which would basically mean there's twice as many profits, or not necessarily, but that's kind of the thought process. And so that really affected Groupon in terms of their value. Originally, people would put a value of $20 billion on them. Instantly after that, it was only $10 billion. So just an example of the huge responsibility that companies have to investors is they need to have accurate financial statements because we have nothing else to go off of but the statements produced by these companies. All right, let's look at the responsibility of the community. We're just about finished up here. And there's a couple of things that have to be considered with regards to responsibility to the community. There's a few concepts we're going to go over. First of which is what's known as cause-related marketing. And cause-related marketing entails merely partnerships between a business and a nonprofit organization. And what that's designed to do is to, one, increase sales for the company and then raise money for the nonprofit. So that's kind of the idea behind it, to raise money for the nonprofit. Now, one of the best examples of cause-related marketing is kind of the product Red that came out kind of during the middle. I think it was 05, 06, possibly, maybe a little different in terms of time frame, but around there. And it's still, some companies still engage in it today, but it was more popular then. And that was in response to some of the issues going on, I believe, in South Africa. And so what companies did is they partnered and changed their logos, if you will, to, red. And you can see them here on the screen here. In Starbucks, you had Dell, Apple produced their kind of limited edition red iPod Nano. Gap was another company that was very, very involved. And so they partnered with this particular cause, and some of the proceeds from the purchase went towards that particular cause. And so that would be a primary example of cause-related marketing there. Next, you have corporate philanthropy. This is also something that organizations can do to be socially responsible with their communities, and that involves simply business donations, right? You hear a lot of companies that are donating to different causes, the Boys and Girls Club, Salvation Army, and also donating time. It doesn't have to be a monetary donation. It could be a donation of time as well. And we saw the example I gave at the beginning of lecture, where companies will provide time off for employees if they're going to be involved in a community service project, is an example of corporate philanthropy, because they're essentially still paying their employees, but they're allowing them the time to go ahead and invest in the community. And then next we have corporate responsibility. And these are simply actions of the business rather than donations of money and or time. Acting in socially responsible ways includes using biodegradable products. I was recently at Baja Fresh. Some of you probably are familiar with that restaurant, and all of the containers and different packaging they use are, one, made from recycled materials, but two, are biodegradable. And so that is something that's very, very responsible, because it's not a donation. They're not giving money. They're not giving time, but they're being responsible because they're not creating a bunch of landfills. So they're acting in a responsible way, of course. All right, now responsibility to the environment. Okay, as I mentioned before, this kind of increased attention towards climate change has really ushered in the importance of being environmentally responsible, and it's obviously doing business from a standpoint that you have to consider what the future generation is going to hold and not necessarily harm them for the sake of getting short-term profits. And primary issues come up. Reducing the carbon footprint has been very, very important, obviously. Green marketing, you see a lot of companies that are marketing just what they're actually doing in the environment, of course. One of those companies, IBM, is voted consistently one of the most green companies, and they do a number of different things. You can kind of research that on your own if you're interested, but have definitely free up employees to go serve in the community. They make a lot of different donations. They established different kind of warehouses, if you will, that don't emit certain emissions and are more conscious of energy and all those different things. And so, consistently gets rated, IBM that is, one of the greenest companies for a number of years. And so they do a lot of different efforts. At the top here you see BP, which, although their logo is green to illustrate that they are a green company, obviously had some issues not so recently, or not that were with the BP, the oil spill that took place after the Deepwater Horizon disaster that resulted in the death of several employees that were actually on the oil rig, and then subsequently pumped a numerous amount of gallons of oil into the Gulf and significantly hampered that particular area of the world. So they had a very big issue there as well, because you saw the backlash from the community, from employees. You had fishermen that weren't able to actually go out and earn an income because the entire Gulf was just full of oil and all these different things. And so you see the ramifications of what happens when a company doesn't act responsibly, when they try to overlook certain things to reduce expenses, which was one of the issues related to BP. And obviously they came out and talked about, had press releases and ran television advertisements talking about, well, we're here in the Gulf, we're committed, we're staying here, all these different things. but a lot of people overlook that because simply the devastation that happened in that area of the world. All right, last thing we're going to go over here real quick is social responsibility is really looked at as in terms of a spectrum. It isn't black or white, you're socially responsible or you're not. And a lot of times, too, it depends on the issue, right? McDonald's, for example, has the Ronald McDonald House, and they give a lot of money towards that particular cause. But then you might argue with regards to some of their food, or at least recently, before they made some changes, that they were contributing to obesity. So from a social responsibility standpoint, maybe they are not really contributing in this area, but they are contributing in another. So don't simply stamp one company as socially responsible or not. You have to consider the situation, because it can vary, of course, much like the McDonald's example. But in terms of the spectrum, you can look at it from a number of different ways. First, being less responsible, you have no contribution. And that's they don't recognize any obligation, and they do really what's only legally required. You're following the rule of the law, which, like we said, is not a good litmus test for what is ethical, but you can follow that. You're not breaking any laws here, but you're not going above and beyond to really improve the environment or to improve your employees' lives or anything like that. Next, you have our responsive contributions. And responsive contributions really involve customers on a case-by-case basis, or businesses, mind you, will agree to certain requests. They're not going to, once again, go out of their way, but if they're approached by a particular cause, maybe they'll be inclined to donate money. They're not going to go out and seek them, but they may agree if they're requested. And one of the things a lot of companies do is they agree to match certain contributions. And I've seen a lot of companies do this. And this might be an example of a responsive contribution, because they're not making the contributions themselves. But if an employee says, hey, I want to donate, $1,000 to the Red Cross, they'll match that. And so it is more responsive, because they're not being proactive in doing it themselves. They're waiting for employees to kind of bring it up to them. And lastly, towards the more responsible end of the spectrum, you have proactive contributions. And being proactive, obviously, as a business, is going out there on their own. They're taking the initiative, and they're contributing to their particular environment, if you will, contributing to society, to the lives of customers or employees or investors. They're being very, very proactive is kind of the idea here. And so obviously you're taking the initiative. You're not waiting for someone to approach you, but you're going out and you're trying to maybe tackle some type of social injustice or other issue that's prevalent in society. All right, that finishes up for today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to post a brief video on Starbucks. Starbucks is a company that, in my opinion, has behaved socially responsible in a number of different ways, but most notably with their suppliers. So I do want you to take a look at the video. It's not too lengthy. From what I remember, it's probably 8 to 10 minutes or so, and just goes over some of the practices that Starbucks is attempting to do to obviously enhance the lives of the people that they do business with in some of these areas of the world. So thank you for listening and being a part. If you have any questions, let me know. Have a great week.